October 9, 1956. Inside Reeves Sound Studios in New York City, a 39-year-old pianist sits at the keyboard, surrounded by some of the finest jazz musicians in America. Sonny Rollins on tenor saxophone, Max Roach behind the drums, Oscar Pettiford on bass, Ernie Henry on alto saxophone. They're here to record an album. But first, they need to discuss something uncomfortable. For 6 years, Thelonious Monk has been effectively banned from performing in his own city. Not because he wasn't talented, not because audiences didn't want to hear him, but because the New York Police Department revoked a small piece of paper that every jazz musician needed to work in venues that served alcohol, something called a cabaret card. Without it, Monk couldn't play in the clubs where jazz happened, the clubs where reputations were built, where musicians connected with audiences night after night, honing their craft in real time. The story began in August 1951. Monk and his friend, pianist Bud Powell, were sitting in a parked car when police searched the vehicle and found narcotics. Rather than let Powell face another arrest, Powell had already been institutionalized and brutalized by the system. Monk refused to testify. He took responsibility. He spent 60 days in prison, and when he got out, his cabaret card was gone. For a jazz musician in 1950s New York, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was professional death. The cabaret card system had been introduced in 1940, ostensibly to prevent organized crime figures from infiltrating nightclubs, but in practice it became a weapon wielded almost exclusively against black musicians. One drug arrest, one altercation with police, one perceived act of defiance, and your card could vanish. With it went your livelihood. Billie Holiday lost hers and couldn't perform in New York clubs for over a decade, even after serving her time. Charlie Parker lost his. Miles Davis would lose his. And Monk lost his at the worst possible moment. Just as bebop, the revolutionary style he'd helped create at Minton's Playhouse in the early 1940s, was becoming the dominant force in jazz. So while his compositions became jazz standards, while other musicians built careers playing his music, Monk himself scraped by with out-of-town gigs, sporadic concerts, and the charity of friends. Chief among them was a woman who would become one of the most important figures in his life, Baroness Pannonica de Königswarter. Nika, as she was known, was born into the Rothschild banking dynasty, raised in English mansions with exotic animals roaming the grounds. But in 1948, while married to a French diplomat and living in Mexico, she heard Thelonious Monk's recording of Round Midnight for the first time. She played it 20 times in a row and missed her flight home. Soon after, she left her marriage, moved to New York, and dedicated herself to the musicians creating bebop. She paid rent for struggling artists, drove them to gigs in her Bentley, fed them when they were broke. Charlie Parker died in her hotel suite in 1955, a scandal that got her evicted but didn't stop her mission. For Monk, Nika became more than a patron. She became his protector, his advocate, and his friend. She understood that what others called eccentricity was often mental illness. Probably bipolar disorder, undiagnosed and untreated. When Monk had episodes, when the world became too much, Nika was there. But even Nika's support couldn't give Monk what he really needed: recognition, critical respect, the chance to prove that his angular melodies, his dissonant harmonies, his seemingly chaotic sense of time weren't mistakes. They were genius. In 1955, a new opportunity emerged. Producer Orrin Keepnews had co-founded Riverside Records and wanted to sign Monk. He paid Prestige Records a mere $108 to buy out Monk's contract. Bob Weinstock, Prestige's president, didn't fight it. Monk's albums didn't sell. Keepnews had a plan. He believed Monk's original compositions were too strange for mainstream audiences. So for Monk's first 2 Riverside albums, he pushed the pianist to record standards. First from the Duke Ellington songbook, then familiar jazz tunes. No original Monk compositions, just prove you can play the songs people know. Monk complied. though it pained him. The albums were well played but unremarkable. They didn't break through. Now, in October 1956, Keep News was finally letting Monk record his own music. An entire album of Monk originals played by a quintet of virtuosos. Everything was riding on this session. Everything was about to go spectacularly wrong. The first session on October 9th went reasonably well. The band recorded 2 compositions dedicated to Baroness Nika. Panonica, a tender ballad where Monk played celesta instead of piano, and Balue Bolivar Balue Sar. Monk's exaggerated pronunciation of Blue Bolivar Blues, named after the Bolivar Hotel where Nika had taken residence after being kicked out of the Stanhope. But those were the warm-up. 6 days later, on October 15th, they would attempt the title track, Brilliant Corners. Even before the session began, tension filled the studio. Unlike most band leaders, Monk hadn't provided sheet music. Following Duke Ellington's philosophy, he believed the best way to learn a song was by ear. The band had rehearsed for days, but Brilliant Corners wasn't like other jazz compositions. Standard jazz tunes followed predictable forms, usually 32 bars divided into sections of 8. Blues followed a 12-bar structure. These were the foundations every jazz musician knew instinctively. Brilliant Corners used a 22-bar structure, an 8-bar A section, followed by a 7-bar B section, then a modified 7-bar return to A. But it wasn't just the unusual bar count. The melody itself featured difficult intervals and angular leaps, and then there was the tempo. The composition shifted between single-time and double-time sections, requiring the entire band to navigate these changes together with split-second precision. Sonny Rollins, fresh off recording his breakthrough album Saxophone Colossus just 4 months earlier, was the only one who seemed to have a handle on the piece. His solo on the recording would become legendary. He played ahead of the beat, behind the beat, through the single-time passages with swagger and the double-time sections with blistering speed. But Max Roach and Oscar Pettiford struggled. Roach, one of bebop's pioneering drummers, a master of complex rhythms, found himself constantly thrown off by Monk's accents and the shifting meters. Pettiford, a technically brilliant bassist who had played with everyone from Duke Ellington to Charlie Parker, openly complained about the composition structure. "You don't have enough bars," he told Monk at one point, his frustration evident. Monk characteristically said little in response. He tried to help by not playing during Ernie Henry's alto saxophone solo, giving Henry space to navigate the changes without distraction. During Pettiford's solo sections, Monk would simply stop, then come roaring back in at unexpected moments, a technique that worked brilliantly on the final recording, but added to the chaos in the moment. The hours stretched on. Producer Orrin Keepnews had developed a habit of assigning a take number to every start, even the false starts and immediate breakdowns. He thought it would make editing easier later. What he didn't anticipate was how many numbers he would need. Take 1, breakdown. Take 5, breakdown. Take 10, breakdown. Take 15. Still no complete performance. At one point, Keepnews and the engineer realized they couldn't hear Pettiford's bass. They stopped the session, checked the microphone, examined the connections. Everything was working fine. Then they looked at Pettiford. He was pantomiming, moving his fingers over the strings without actually playing. Whether it was protest, exhaustion, or a complete mental breakdown, no one was quite sure. Take 20, take 21, take 22. 4 hours into the session, they had attempted Brilliant Corners 25 times, 25 announced takes on tape. Not a single complete performance. Keepnews faced a decision. They could schedule another session, have the band rehearse more, try again. But Ernie Henry had just quit to join Dizzy Gillespie's band. Oscar Pettiford was so angry he refused to come back. Sonny Rollins and Max Roach had road dates that would take them out of town for weeks. Or Keepnews could try something almost unheard of in jazz at the time. edit together a master version from multiple takes. Jazz was supposed to be live, spontaneous. What you heard on a record was supposed to be what happened in that moment, in that room, with those musicians. Editing was for pop music, for orchestral recordings where perfection was expected, not for jazz. But Keep News had no choice. He listened to all 25 takes, found the best sections, Rollins's opening statement from one take, Monk's solo from another, the ensemble playing from a third, and spliced them together with recording engineer Jack Higgins. It was innovative, unprecedented, and slightly desperate. It would create one of the most important jazz recordings of all time. With brilliant corners assembled through studio magic, Keep News needed to complete the album. On December 7, 1956, nearly 2 months after the initial sessions, he brought Monk back to Reeves Sound Studios. The lineup had changed. Paul Chambers, the brilliant young bassist from Miles Davis's quintet, replaced Oscar Pettiford. Clark Terry, the trumpeter from Duke Ellington's orchestra, replaced Ernie Henry. Sonny Rollins and Max Roach returned. The session was smoother. They recorded Bemsha Swing, the only previously recorded composition on the album. Monk had cut it before with Miles Davis. Terry's trumpet brought a different energy than Henry's alto, more playful, more fluid. But Keep News still needed more music. The album was running short. In a move that would prove inspired, he had Monk sit down at the piano alone and record a solo version of I Surrender Dear, a 1931 pop standard. Monk's interpretation was quintessentially him. He played the melody at odd angles, inserted unexpected pauses, made the familiar sound alien and beautiful. It showcased what made him unique, not just his compositions but his approach to the piano itself. The way he used space. The way he could make a single note mean something. When Keep News assembled the final album, Brilliant Corners had 5 tracks. Brilliant Corners, the impossible title track, Balue Bolivar Baluesar, the slow blues dedicated to Nika's Hotel Panonica, the ballad with Monk on Celesta, I Surrender Dear, Monk's solo interpretation, Bemsha Swing, the up-tempo closer with Terry and Chambers. On the album's back cover, Keep News wrote liner notes that hinted at the struggle. These men worked hard. They struggled and concentrated and shook their heads over some passages with those half-smiles that mean, hard. This is impossible. For the original compositions on this date represent Monk at his most inventive and therefore at his most challenging. Brilliant Corners, with its uneven meter and its tempo changes, is undoubtedly the real backbreaker. Interestingly, Keep News got one detail wrong. He wrote that Brilliant Corners had uneven meter, when actually it stayed in 4/4 time throughout. What made it difficult was the odd bar count, the unusual structure, but the error reveals something true. Even the producer who edited the track together struggled to articulate exactly what made it so challenging. The album was released in April 1957, and then something remarkable happened. Nat Hentoff, editor of Downbeat magazine, gave Brilliant Corners 5 stars. He called it Riverside's most important modern jazz LP to date. Other critics followed. Metronome raved. Japan's Swing Journal called it a masterpiece. By year's end, Downbeat would declare Brilliant Corners the most critically acclaimed jazz album of 1957, but the critical praise was only part of the story. The album did something more important. It changed how people heard Thelonious Monk. For years, Monk had been dismissed as an eccentric, a primitive, someone who couldn't play properly. Even well-meaning critics described him as inscrutable. The implication was always there. Maybe he wasn't talented, just weird. Brilliant Corners made that interpretation impossible. Here was an album that was difficult precisely because it was sophisticated. Musicians couldn't play it not because it was simple, but because it was complex beyond what most jazz compositions demanded. The angular melodies weren't mistakes. They were deliberate choices that required extraordinary skill to execute. John S. Wilson of the New York Times captured the shift. The album was proof that this man, who was once viewed as an inscrutable eccentric, is slowly developing into one of the most valid jazz voices of this decade. But there was a delicious irony in that statement. Monk wasn't developing into anything. He'd been composing and playing at this level for years. What had changed wasn't Monk. It was the audience's ability to hear him. Perhaps even more importantly, Brilliant Corners arrived at the exact moment when Sonny Rollins was breaking through with Saxophone Colossus. Rollins's presence on Brilliant Corners, his stunning performance on the title track, meant that the album got attention from people following Rollins's meteoric rise. As producer Orrin Keepnews later acknowledged, Sonny, through the immediate prominence that he got from Saxophone Colossus, was as responsible as anything, possibly more so, for the initial attention that Brilliant Corners got. The two albums fed each other's success, and for Monk, the timing couldn't have been better, because something else was about to change. Through Baroness Nika's advocacy and the renewed attention from Brilliant Corners, Monk's cabaret card was reinstated in mid-1957. After 6 years, he could finally perform in New York clubs again. In July 1957, just months after Brilliant Corners was released, Thelonious Monk opened at the 5-Spot Cafe in Manhattan's East Village. The club was tiny, a former working-class bar that had been transformed into an artist hangout. But Monk's engagement would put it on the map. His quartet featured a tenor saxophonist who was struggling with his own demons, John Coltrane. Coltrane had just been fired from Miles Davis's quintet. Not for lack of talent. Everyone recognized Coltrane was extraordinary. But he'd been trying to kick heroin while still performing, and the attempt to go cold turkey while working, combined with the alcohol he drank to ease withdrawal symptoms, had left him disheveled and unreliable. Davis, exasperated, had let him go. Coltrane used the opportunity to get clean. In May 1957, he apparently won his battle with heroin during a 2-week period of intense focus. He'd already been rehearsing informally with Monk, learning his compositions. Now Monk offered him a lifeline: join the quartet at the 5-Spot. What happened over the next 6 months became legend. Night after night, Monk and Coltrane explored a musical dialogue that would influence generations of jazz musicians. Monk's angular, unexpected approach to harmony pushed Coltrane to find new paths through chord progressions. Coltrane's sheets of sound technique, rapid cascades of notes that seemed to explore every possible harmonic permutation, found the perfect foil in Monk's spacious, deliberate playing. Lines formed outside the 5-Spot. Jazz musicians, critics, artists, intellectuals, everyone wanted to witness this collaboration. Nika would arrive in her Bentley and word would spread. Play well. The Baroness is out front. The residency launched both men to new heights. For Monk, it was vindication. Proof that given the chance to perform regularly, he could command an audience. For Coltrane, it was a masterclass in harmonic sophistication that would inform everything he did afterward. Bassist Wilbur Ware and drummer Shadow Wilson completed the quartet initially, though the rhythm section would change over the months. What remained constant was the musical intensity and the sense that something historically significant was happening. In November 1957, the quartet performed at Carnegie Hall for a benefit concert. The recording was lost for decades, discovered only in 2005 in the Library of Congress archives. When it was finally released as Thelonious Monk Quartet with John Coltrane at Carnegie Hall, it revealed a band that had reached an extraordinary level of cohesion. By December 1957, Coltrane left to rejoin Miles Davis's group. But the 5-Spot residency continued, with Monk bringing in other saxophonists, including Johnny Griffin. The club became synonymous with Monk, and Monk became synonymous with modern jazz. Brilliant Corners didn't just salvage Monk's career, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of hard bop and jazz composition. Before Brilliant Corners, Hard bop, the style that emerged in the mid-1950s as a response to the sometimes antiseptic West Coast cool jazz, emphasized blues and gospel influences, strong rhythmic drive, and extended improvisation. But the compositions themselves often stuck to familiar structures. Brilliant Corners showed that you could have all the emotional intensity of hard bop while using unconventional forms. The album's title track, with its 22-bar structure and shifting tempos, became a model for how to blend bebop's improvisational freedom with more angular, rhythmically challenging composition. Max Roach, who struggled with the track during recording, would later incorporate odd time signatures and complex polyrhythmic structures into his own work as a bandleader. Sonny Rollins, whose solo on Brilliant Corners remains one of his finest recorded performances, drew on the album's harmonic density in his subsequent explorations. Perhaps more importantly, Brilliant Corners became essential listening in jazz education. Conservatory students studied how Monk's angular melodies created their own logic, how the sidemen adapted their phrasing over irregular forms, how ensemble interplay could navigate challenging terrain. The album was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1999. In 2003, it was among the first 50 recordings chosen for the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, recognizing its cultural, historical, or aesthetic importance. Music critic Robert Christgau would later write that Brilliant Corners, along with Monk's 1958 live album Misterioso, represented Monk's artistic peak. AllMusic's Lindsay Planer declared it may well be considered the alpha and omega of post-World War II American jazz. No serious jazz collection should be without it. The Penguin Guide to Jazz included it in its core collection of essential recordings, and decades later it continues to appear on lists of the greatest jazz albums ever made. Among the album's 5 tracks, Pannonica stands as one of Monk's most beautiful compositions. Played on celesta rather than piano, the melody has a delicate, almost music box quality, while still maintaining Monk's characteristic harmonic sophistication. It was one of 24 compositions that jazz musicians dedicated to Baroness Nika de Koenigswarter. Nika's Dream by Horace Silver, Nika's Tempo by Gigi Grice, Tonica by Kenny Dorham, Blues for Nika by Barry Harris, and many others. But Monk's tribute was special. The two had formed a bond that transcended typical artist-patron relationships. Nika understood Monk's mental health struggles from personal experience. Her own father had battled depression and ultimately died by suicide. She recognized that Monk's periods of withdrawal, his sometimes erratic behavior, weren't character flaws but symptoms of illness that required compassion rather than judgment. When Monk had episodes, Nika was often the one who helped. She drove him to doctors. She sat with him during difficult periods. She intervened when police harassed him, which happened frequently, especially when they traveled together in the South, where a black man and white woman walking arm in arm drew hostile stares and worse. In 1958, while driving to a gig in Delaware, Monk and Nika were stopped by police. When Monk refused to answer questions, whether due to one of his episodes or simple defiance, the officers beat him with a blackjack. They found marijuana in the car. Nika immediately claimed it was hers. The case eventually collapsed due to the illegal detention and the beating, but it showed Nika's willingness to put herself at risk for the musicians she supported. She would later be convicted on marijuana charges in another incident and face deportation proceedings, though she successfully fought them. Their friendship remained platonic. Monk was devoted to his wife Nellie, who in many ways was grateful to share the burden of caring for her husband's complex needs. But the bond between Monk and Nika was profound. In the final decade of his life, when Monk largely withdrew from public performance, he lived at Nika's home in Weehawken, New Jersey. He died there on February 17, 1982. Pannonica captures something of that relationship. Tender without being sentimental, complex without being difficult, beautiful in an unconventional way. Orrin Keepnews's decision to edit Brilliant Corners from multiple takes was controversial at the time and remained so for years. Jazz purists argued that editing violated the music's essential nature as spontaneous, live performance. But Keepnews had a different perspective. "I never felt that I was supposed to play the date," he explained years later. "The musicians are supposed to play the date. I'm not supposed to be a musician or engineer and never make the mistake of trying to be either. My job is to make it happen as well as it possibly can." For Keepnews, the producer's role was to serve the music and the musicians, not to impose rigid ideologies about how jazz should be recorded. If editing was what it took to capture Monk's vision, a composition so complex that it couldn't be played perfectly in real time even by virtuosos, then editing was the right choice. The success of Brilliant Corners vindicated that decision and actually expanded possibilities for how jazz could be recorded. While spontaneity remained valued, producers and engineers recognized that studio techniques could sometimes serve rather than diminish the music. Keepnews's work with Monk on Riverside Records would produce several of the most important albums in jazz history. Between 1955 and 1961, Monk participated in 30 recording sessions for Riverside, releasing 14 studio and live albums. Among them, his collaboration with John Coltrane recorded at the 5 Spot, the legendary quartet with Charlie Rouse, and numerous other essential recordings. Later, Keepnews would produce crucial albums for Bill Evans, Cannonball Adderley, Wes Montgomery, and many others. He won 5 Grammy Awards over his career, including for album notes on the complete Riverside collection of Monk recordings. In 2011, the National Endowment for the Arts named him a jazz master for his contributions to the field. But looking back decades later, Keepnews was clear about what he'd learned from Monk. "I probably learned as much about living from him as I did about music," he said. This was a man whose music was initially ridiculed by people who damn well should have known better. A man who stayed true to himself. "I learned how to conduct my life, what to insist on for myself and of myself." The cabaret card system that had silenced Monk for 6 years wasn't abolished until 1967. After mounting pressure from musicians' unions, civil rights organizations, and journalists who recognized its discriminatory application. By then, it had damaged countless careers and altered the course of jazz history. Beyond Monk, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and Miles Davis all lost crucial performing years to the system. The policy determined not just who could be heard, but where musical development happened and which collaborations were possible. For Monk specifically, those 6 years from 1951 to 1957 represented his prime creative years. He was in his 30s and early 40s, composing prolifically, developing his unique style. But instead of performing regularly in New York's clubs, where musicians honed their craft nightly, where they built audiences and industry connections, he was relegated to sporadic out-of-town gigs and occasional concert dates. What made Brilliant Corners even more significant was that it achieved what the cabaret card system had tried to prevent. It made Monk impossible to ignore. The album's critical success, combined with the restoration of his cabaret card, meant that by 1958, Downbeat had chosen Monk as Best Pianist in their International Critics poll, beating out Oscar Peterson, Errol Garner, and Earl Hines. The 5 Spot residency that followed became a model for how jazz clubs could support serious music. The 6-month engagement with Coltrane launched the club to national prominence and showed that audiences would come for challenging, uncompromising jazz if given the chance. By 1964, Monk appeared on the cover of Time magazine, an extraordinarily rare honor for a jazz artist. He signed a lucrative contract with Columbia Records in 1962, toured internationally, and commanded high fees for performances. All of this would have been unimaginable just 7 years earlier. But the question lingers. What if Monk had been able to perform continuously through the early 1950s? How much further might his music have developed? What collaborations might have occurred? The cabaret card system didn't just hurt individual musicians. It impoverished American culture by silencing some of its most innovative artists during their creative peaks, particularly black artists who faced systemic racism from law enforcement. "A genius is one who is most like himself," Monk once said. And Brilliant Corners is Monk at his most monk. The album succeeds not despite its difficulty but because of it. The angular melodies, the unexpected harmonic choices, the unconventional structures. These aren't obstacles to enjoyment, but invitations to hear music differently. Listen to Brilliant Corners today, and you can still hear why 25 takes weren't enough. The composition seems to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously. Monk's comping, his accompaniment behind the soloists, doesn't support them in traditional ways. He drops out entirely, then stabs back in with dissonant chords at unexpected moments. It's destabilizing, but it creates space for the soloists to explore. Sonny Rollins responded to that space by playing some of the most inventive phrases of his career. Max Roach, despite his struggles during the session, delivered drumming that was both supportive and challenging, pushing against the time while holding it together. The album's influence extends beyond jazz. Rock musicians, classical composers, and producers across genres have studied how Brilliant Corners uses space, dissonance, and asymmetry. The idea that difficulty itself can be beautiful, that music doesn't need to be immediately accessible to be profound. These concepts became central to progressive and experimental music. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler. Brilliant Corners proved that Thelonious Monk was right. For years, critics had suggested he should play differently, compose differently, make his music more accessible. Instead, Monk stayed true to his vision. He insisted on recording his own compositions with Riverside. He refused to simplify. And when the album finally appeared, recorded under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, assembled through unprecedented studio techniques, it demonstrated that the supposed eccentric was actually a master. The critic Robert Christgau got it right when he called Brilliant Corners Monk's artistic peak. Not because Monk changed, but because everyone else finally caught up. Today, Brilliant Corners stands as one of the defining recordings of 20th century American music. It represents a specific moment when artistic vision, technical innovation, critical reception, and cultural circumstances aligned perfectly. The album that was almost impossible to record became impossible to ignore. Thelonious Monk once said of himself, "I say, play your own way. Don't play what the public want. You play what you want and let the public pick up on what you're doing, even if it does take them 15-20 years." With Brilliant Corners, it took much less than that, and we're still catching up. The impact on jazz, Brilliant Corners legitimized compositional complexity in hard bop and inspired generations of musicians to push beyond standard forms. It showed that jazz could be intellectually demanding without losing emotional power. That difficulty could itself be a form of beauty. The album's influence can be heard in everything from Ornette Coleman's free jazz experiments to Robert Glasper's contemporary explorations. On recording, Orrin Keepnews's decision to edit the title track from multiple takes opened new possibilities for jazz production. While live performance remained valued, the studio could now be recognized as its own creative space where difficult visions could be realized through technical innovation. On Society, the album's success during Monk's cabaret card ban highlighted systemic racism in the entertainment industry and contributed to the eventual abolition of the discriminatory system. It demonstrated that artistic genius could overcome institutional barriers, though at great personal cost. What we learn. Brilliant Corners teaches us that staying true to your vision, even when the world tells you to change, even when it seems commercially unwise, can ultimately be vindicated. It reminds us that what seems impossible today might simply require new approaches, new technologies, new ways of listening. Most importantly, it shows that great art doesn't need to compromise itself for its audience. Sometimes the audience just needs time to catch up.